I'm live. I continue. A lot to remember. This is largely about travel journeys of Joan. She had far memory, and I've read most of her books. This one was missing. It is published. It was published in 1962, and it is explaining journeys she did in the south of France, or in France. I just finished the first chapter, which was to the Loire, and chapter 2 is the family of Francois Premier. The valley of the Loire is no more than a prelude to the Lot, which is a small place as well. But here the visions begin to widen, and the centuries to unfurl their banners. There are more facts in the history of its illustrious chateau than there are notes in a symphony, but I will offer a stave from the tune, as an errant boy who may whistle a theme from Mozart. The principal actors on this stage belong to the 16th century, and so are contemporary with our Tudors. But while Henry VIII and his three children, Edward, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth I, ruled England, there were 3 instead of 2 generations of the French royal family. Its progenitor, Francois I, the Francois Premier, whose name runs like a leitmotif through the spiel of nearly every chateau guide, lacked none of the magnificent flamboyance of Henry Tudor, nor was he a less exuberant patron of the of the Renaissance of the art. Did Henry, one wonders, revere Holbein as Francois revered Leonardo da Vinci, who was the only man in France in whose presence the king respectfully took off his hat? Francois was far more fortunate than was Henry with women. He opined that a court without women is like a year without spring, or a spring without roses. Perhaps because he was born with 2 women kneeling at his feet. These women were his wise and loving mother, Louise, Countess of Angoulême, and his sister, the Marguerite of Marguerites, who married the King of Navarre. His first queen was his cousin, Claude, so kindly a woman that she deserves to be remembered for more than giving her name, Claude, to the plume we know as greengage. She was lame, like her mother Anne of Brittany, whose oratory at Loches has an intimate perfection which shows that she did not feel it needful to set a cohort of clerics between herself and her gentle God. Many were Anne's prayers for a son in whom Brittany and France would be united, but these prayers were not answered. She had no children by her first royal husband, Charles VIII, that estimable young man who died after hitting his head on a low doorway while hurrying to play jeu de paume at Amboise, the game which is the ancestor of lawn tennis, and still called the game of kings. And as the queen of What Louis is that? I'm not good with Roman figures. She had only one daughter, Claude. Louis had divorced his first wife, Louis' daughter, Jeanne of France, in order to marry Anne. It was a marriage of expediency, but he became so devoted to her that when she died, his tears were considered embarrassingly excessive for a royal mourner. However, at last he dried them and took for his new bride Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, who in every aspect differed from Henry's daughter of the same name, often prefixed with bloody. Francoise, who was the heir to a sickly old man and married to that old man's daughter, cannot have relished the prospect of welcoming his new stepmother-in-law, as Mary already was, having been married to Louis in England by proxy. But he arrayed himself in cloth of silver and gold, with a cloak of white silk thrown over his shoulders, when he went to meet her at Abbeville. He must have known that she was only 16, but he certainly did not expect her to be ravishingly lovely. Her red gold hair, her sparkling blue eyes, what might these not kindle in the feeble king? One can well imagine Francois's anxiety when, on the morning after the wedding night, a radiant Louis announced to his astonished courtiers, "I have worked miracles." For the next 2 months he continued to report his amatory progress in such phrases as, "I am in tremendous fettle," or "I am in really magnificent form." But then his vigour proved to have been the last flickers of a dying fire, and he took to his bed to wait in it alone for death. Death kept Louis waiting for 5 months, during which Mary caused a fresh crop of anxieties to arise in Francois. He discovered that for 2 years she had been in love with Suffolk, the English ambassador, who had accompanied her from England. Francois appealed to his mother, who briskly told Suffolk that should he donate a Dauphin de France, she and her son would become joint regents, and their first act would be to send the baby's papa in disgrace back to England. Suffolk must have been greatly relieved that the French view of queenly infidelities was so much less stringent than pertaining at the court of his royal master, where he would have lost his head, literally, instead of receiving 50,000 livres from the kindly countess as compensation for her having forbidden him to lose it again, figuratively. Francois, who was since infancy had been loved and loving, was in no way a jealous man, and sincerely sympathized with Suffolk, for by now he too had fallen in love with Mary. So that his rival should not feel neglected, Francois arranged for his favorite mistress to keep the Englishman happily occupied. However, the Countess now took a firm hand in the domestic arrangements. Realizing that her son was only too likely to provide the heir which would lose him his kingdom, she decreed that Mary was to share Claude's bed until Louis died, a simple solution to the problem, which continued until Mary was widowed on New Year's Day, 1515. Yet even then, Francois was not sure of his throne, for Mary pointed out to him that, as she did not feel inclined to swear on oath that there was no possibility of her being pregnant, he must wait the prescribed 40 days before he could be certain that she was not carrying a posthumous child. During this period she was guarded day and night by 2 ladies at a time behind the barred doors and shutters of the Hotel de Cluny. The anxieties of Francois increased, for it was reported that each day the queen grew a little fatter. Rumors that she was enceinte spread throughout France, throughout Europe, until the Countess discovered that Mary was only teasing them by wearing each day an additional layer of undergarments. Again Francois proved the goodness of his nature, for instead of being furious he did his best to persuade Mary to marry him, even though this would have entailed divorcing Claude, of whom he was fond. But Mary prettily declined this pressing invitation, again to become the reigning Queen of France. Instead, she retrieved Suffolk from his temporary nesting place, took him back to England, and married him. The game of kings was again to play a part in changing history, as it had done when an earlier Dauphin was foolish enough to send a basket of tennis balls to Henry V, implying that he was more familiar with the use of them than he was with balls designed for cannon. For the eldest son of Francois drank a glass of water while overheated after playing tennis, and shortly expired in agony. Some historians are of the opinion that the water had been poisoned at the behest of his sister-in-law, Catherine de Medici, but experience of the after effects of drinking water in French villages suggests that there is no need to take so dramatic a view. So when Francois died in 1547, he was succeeded by his second son, Henry II, who was so different in character to his father that neither of them was ever able to understand the other. Henry never overcame the bitter resentment he felt at having been sent to Spain to replace his father as a hostage after Francois had been captured at the Battle of Pavia, which was fought on Italian soil. Henry was 14 when at last he returned from the arid formality of the Spanish court. He was shocked to find a gay father surrounded by adoring women, and Francois was no less dismayed to meet a son who had become priggish and uncouth and even spoke French with a strong accent. Instead of nagging the boy, Francois again displayed his innate understanding by putting his son under the care of Diane de Poitiers. She was 20 years older than Henry and one of the most beautiful and cultured women of her generation. Under her gentle tutelage at her chateau of Annay, he became less withdrawn, less boorish, and then fell passionately in love with her, and she with him, a devotion that increased throughout their lives. One can well understand his resurgence of bitterness against his father when he was told that he must marry the Pope's niece, Catherine de Medici, who had nothing to command her except enormous riches. To make matters worse, she was plain as well as bourgeois, and he thought she had not even the wit to realize that the court ladies referred to her, behind her back, as the goldsmith's daughter. For years he refused to play his part in providing an heir to the throne, until Diane at last managed to persuade him that he could no longer avoid this distasteful duty. Throughout Henry's reign, Diane, except by legal title, was his beloved queen, while Catherine was little more than an incubator of his progeny. This service she performed 8 times on the last occasion which delivered of twins who failed to survive infancy. With the exception of her third son, later to become Henry III, for whom she had a devastating devotion, she saw her children only as pawns in the battle of power, religious and political, for she had been ruthlessly trained since early childhood. She had been deliberately conditioned by the Medicis to regard any form of human affection as a degrading weakness, a devil's distraction from blind obedience to the dictates of church and state. Her father, in order to be able to assure the Pope that she was an instrument well-tempered to their purpose, had even gone to the lengths of poisoning her favorite lapdog and forcing the child to watch without displaying any emotion while it slowly expired in agony. This was only one of the means by which Catherine was taught how to close her heart against any trace of affection. So it is not surprising that all her children were deficient in physical, mental, or spiritual health. In the eldest son, Francois, this defect showed itself only through bodily symptoms, a lesser handicap due no doubt to his good fortune in being brought up by Diane de Poitiers, so that he could be educated with the child he was to marry, whom his father had already put under her benign aegis. This child was Mary Stuart, who, when she came to France at the age of 4, was already Queen of Scotland in her own right. Francoise and Mary loved each other dearly, but their idyllic childhood, with its background of Diane's chateau of Annay and Chenonceau, came abruptly to an end when a lance splintered a tournament in Paris. The broken lance jerked upwards, forcing open the visor of the royal tilting helm, and a splinter pierced Henry's right eye. In an attempt to assess the extent of the brain injury, surgeons pierced with similar splinters the eyes of 4 criminals from the Chavet prison, finally freshly decapitated for the purpose. But any information they may have gained proved ineffective, and in 4 days the king died. Catherine, the wife, had been queen only in name. Catherine, the widow, through her children, ruled a darkened France. Her religious fanaticism was at first disguised as political necessity, as when in the courtyard of Amboise, Huguenots were slaughtered on the pretext of conspiracy, while the appalled Francois and Mary were forced to watch. Catherine had the corpses festooned from the balconies of the chateau, perhaps to demonstrate that her nerves were much stronger than those of her son and his wife, who had fainted at the dreadful spectacle. But although she did not fear her victims' ghosts, the stench of rotting flesh soon caused her to move the court to Blois. Francois II, when under the protection of Diane, had been comparatively healthy, though never robust. But Mary was not old nor wise enough to shield him from his mother's implacable demands on his slender resources, and in 1560, after reigning less than a year, he died, and the crown passed to Charles, his brother. Charles was prey to delusion of persecution and to maniacal outbursts of sadistic rage. His court soon became known as the most dissolute court the world has ever seen. But although his strange amusements could only be factually described in a textbook of psychiatry, he tried to check his mother's fanatical hatred of Protestants until she at last managed to coerce him into giving the orders for the Holocaust, which is usually referred to as the Massacre of St. Bartholomew. It began at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 24th of August, 1572, and by midday over 2,000 corpses littered the streets and quays of Paris, and even the corridors of the Louvre itself. Charles, no doubt feeling that his crusade was getting too close for comfort, gave orders for the killing to cease. There was a lull, but only a lull. The following morning monks appeared in every district of the city, proclaiming that a hawthorn tree had burst into unseasonable bloom in the cemetery of the Innocents, and that this miracle was a sign that God wished the massacre to continue. So a lot more Protestants were killed by Catholics with even greater enthusiasm. 2 years later, Charles died, so to be succeeded by his unpleasant brother, Henry III. Catherine, who could steel herself against every other source of fond emotion, could deny him nothing. When he happened to feel like dressing as a woman, she provided the clothes and paid for the banquet, or mask at which her darling could shine. One wonders which guest, after one of these parties at which Henry, with diamonds in his violet powdered hair, wore a robe of rose and silver damask, its sleeves embroidered with gold thread and clusters of emeralds, was brave enough to comment that the bodice, moulded over an iron corset, was cut so low that chacun a soi un pin, s'il voulait un roi femme, ou bien un homme reine. I don't know what that means. Henry might have developed more benignly had his mother not deliberately thwarted his only spontaneous drive towards a normal outlet for affection. At the wedding of his sister, Margot, to Henry of Navarre, the grandson of Francois Premier's sister Marguerite, he fell passionately in love with Mary, wife of the Prince de Conde. To remove him from the girl whom Catherine saw only as a rival, she arranged for him to leave France to become the King of Poland. However, instead of forgetting Mary, he became even more determined to marry her, and the moment he succeeded to the throne, he set about trying to arrange her divorce. The proceedings were held up because Mary was pregnant, and she died giving birth to a daughter. Henry fell into a delirium of grief which crossed the borders of sanity. Skulls were embroidered on his doublets, and at Avignon, during Christmas week, he donned the habit of a monk to lead a torchlight procession for hours through the streets, while young courtiers, stripped to the waist, lashed each other with whips, until the blood spurted from their bodies in an orgy of masochistic mourning. It is probable that among these youths were Henry's bodyguard of favourites, the 45 Minons, as they came to be called. Those fearsome painted and pomaded bullies, dressed in open-necked doublets, leg-of-mutton sleeves, tight-fitting trunks, and skin-tight hose, to quote from Jean Douchet, to whom I am indebted for much of the information in this chapter. The Minons flattered and fawned at Henry, and they also murdered for him. Their most famous victim was the Duke de Guise, one of the most popular men in France, whom the people had affectionately nicknamed the King of Paris. He was a great man even in stature, being all of 6'6", and it took the combined efforts of several minions to kill him, but at last he died, spouting blood like a fountain from a dozen or more dagger wounds, with his fist thrust into his mouth so that he should not cry out. Catherine, who was also in the chateau of Blois, was still in bed when Henry went to tell her what he had done, boasting that now he was not only the King of France, but the King of Paris. She knew that at last he had gone too far, and that Madame Serpin, as the people called her, could no longer control or protect the viper she had hatched. She made a terrible grimace and fell back in despair, and 11 days later the last of her strength. Sorry, just before the end. Had she lived for another 8 months, she would have seen the son on whom she had lavished such a dreadful wealth of mother love excommunicated for the Guise murder, and then assassinated in a particularly humiliating manner by being stabbed in the pit of the stomach by a pious Dominican monk, Jacques Clement, to whom he was granting audience while seated on the commode. Catherine's son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, who had married her daughter Margot, then became Henry IV. Like his great-uncle Francois Premier, his amatory laurels remained green to the end of his reign, and earned him the affectionate sobriquet of the Vert Galant. That was chapter 2. That was quite difficult.